Hello and welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon, Across Cultures Beyond Traditional Demographics. And we're delighted today to have a very impressive panel of experts who I'd like to introduce now. Karen Sabe. Karen is head of the audience insight team at Mindshare worldwide and is a firm believer in humanizing data to make it more insightful and actionable. And she'll be giving us a view into the world of audience identity and its impact on addressability in media. And following Karen, we'll have William Hanmer-Lloyd, who is head of behavioral planning at Total Media and a senior consultant at Behave, a consultancy that uses human insight and technologies to help clients answer key business challenges. And he's going to cover some different approaches and case studies of using people diagnostic technologies combined with insight into behavior that drives success for clients. Following will be Jon Puleston. Jon is VP of Innovation of the Kantr Profiles Division and heads a team pioneering new research technologies and methodologies. He's recently been working alongside Christopher Grave from Ogilvy's Center for Behavioral Science in the US to find new ways to measure human psychology at scale, for which they've won 4 international research awards. And then Massimo de Zordo is a global marketing manager with international experience, launching many new brands and products in FMCG. These include for Lavazza, Reckitt, Benckiser, and Chelsea Football Club Digital Ventures. Massimo will share his experience of working with global brands and why the one-fits-all brand frameworks and traditional demographics aren't relevant anymore, so particularly in a cross-cultural environment. So those are our panel of experts, and they'll be helping us to understand how we look at target audiences that are evolving rapidly and what tools are available to brands to navigate in these ever-changing waters. And what inspired these sessions were 2 among multiple layers of complexity of brands facing, so technology and AI versus human intelligence, and cultures and subcultures. And to explain much more about this, I'd like to introduce Melanie Chevalier, who is our founder and Chief Executive Officer of Creative Culture, who will present a few striking cross-market examples of why brands that have successfully managed eclectic audiences across cultures and what the secret to success has been. So Melanie, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you again to our great panel of experts on this really, really interesting topic. And thank you to those who submitted their questions during the registration process. We will be running through those as well. So what inspired today's webinar was very much looking at the ever more complex landscape that brands are evolving in internationally. And there were 2 among the multiple layers of complexity that we thought were particularly interesting to look at. The first one was looking at all the advancements in technology and AI that is really enabling to gather lots of data around consumers and their behavior, but also not forgetting that without the analysis and the human intelligence that can come to understand how people think and why they think in this way is very important. Obviously, evolving in multiple cultures, you could have access to a lot of data without really knowing what it means. And the second one was looking at cultures and subcultures and really understanding how brands have to be very careful, because it's not just as easy nowadays to think that a country has a harmonious culture, but understand all of the different layers below that. For those who don't know Creative Culture, very quickly, we are a cross-cultural consultancy. We help brands develop international messages, campaigns, and make sense of the different cultures around the world and how they will impact the behavior and the perception of the audiences in general. To kick off, I thought before we let our panel speak, I would share 3 examples of brands, global and local, who've really successfully positioned themselves in subcultures and even created a niche of their own throughout the years. The first one is Courvoisier and cognac as a segment in general. It's very, very interesting, and there are various multiple target audiences that they address in different countries, and they're very, very different, and the conceptual rituals that come with it are also different. And it is interesting to see that a brand like Courvoisier has anchored itself within the African American community in a country like the US throughout many decades. And understanding that, on the other hand, if you look at other countries like China, for example, they've gone on the bandwagon of gifting and directed more to B2B audiences. But the common thread around Cognac and Courvoisier is really that of refinement, the French heritage and savoir-faire. So how did they become so popular in the US among this segment and this subculture of African American communities, hip hop, rap? So you have to look back at World War II when American soldiers stationed in the southwest of France and discovered this spirit. Back in the US, whiskey was very popular, but essentially targeting the white communities, a lot of brands having named after Confederate leaders. So the African American community turned to cognac in general as their seek for refinement with it, spirits and their conception. And throughout the decades, cognac brands have really been fighting for the fame within the US market and designing fancier and fancier bottles, which wasn't unnoticed by rappers in the 90s. Such examples as Busta Rhymes literally passed the Courvoisier in one of his hits, or Drake referring to Hennessy. Jay-Z endorsed cognac brand Douce, and Snoop Dogg even owns his own brand of cognac, Landy Cognac. So it really is a really interesting segment in Courvoisier as a brand, illustrating how they've embraced the sub-community and the subcultures of music and African Americans within the US to try and still keep this consistent message across other markets where they have a very different target audience. Another interesting one, which everyone knows as well, is Doc Martens, who've been targeting the self-expressionists over many, many decades. Looking at the history, they started back in the early 1900s. The sole was actually designed by a German, I found, doing a bit of research on this over the last few days, which was then patterned by Doc Martens in the UK. And it is in the 60s and the 70s where they became a true British icon and targeting the working class. Self-expression was always very much ingrained within the rebellious, so starting with punk, skinheads, and grunge. And it evolves throughout time into music, art, and any form of creative expression. So again, they created their niche, looking at their own subculture, have not been so active for a few years, and recently have started engaging again within the world of music and with artists such as Post Malone and Miley Cyrus. And the last one, we thought we'd look at a local brand, an interesting one here called Hero, which originates from Southeast Nigeria and who's been competing over the last 4 decades or so against top international brands like Heineken, and is now the 3rd largest beer brand in the country. So it's interesting to see that a local brand has achieved such success by really ingraining itself into the local culture and history and heritage, obviously. It originates from an area in the country who was seeking independence from the country called Biafra. And the brand really is emblematic of this self-determination. And whilst not everyone in the country backs this independent move, they really do get inspired by the message behind it and the fact that it taps into the country's history and heritage. The latest brand campaign, really interesting, called Echefula, which means never forget your identity, has really brought this really strong connector between their audiences and the various groups and segments. And they've even developed a TV reality show, which demonstrates what the local life and culture is really about within that region. Long ado, sorry, after those 3 inspiring brand journeys, I will pass on to Karen, who has equally inspiring content tips around our topic today. Karen, to you.
Thanks, Melanie. I think that's a nice segue to talk about identity, because at Mindshare we believe that at the core of culture is identity, and that touches really nicely with the Hero that you case study that you just mentioned, and the core of that is cultural and national identity, and also a little bit on the Doc Martens, the grunge, the self-expression. That's all about identity and how people identify. But identity has become a buzzword in the industry today. It's become all too common. You hear the future of identity and ID and so on. But we think it has several meanings and several references. On the next slide, you'll see that it can be human identity or digital identifiers. And this is where the fragmentation comes in the world of identity. human identity is a very magical, complex, deep, fluid way that people identify themselves. It's based on claimed data, and it answers the question for us of why. Why do people do what they do? What motivates them? Digital identifiers are behavioral. They're data points or signals that we pick up based on what people do online, and they answer the question, what? What do people do? What are they buying? What are they engaging with? What are they watching? Right now, both sit in a silo, but on the next slide, you'll see that the best thing for us and what we believe in is connecting both of those worlds. So currently, each one has its pros and cons. Human identity can be perceived as old school. We hear this a lot in the research world, actually. Oh, old school claim data, old school panels. And digital identifiers are fraught with complexity at the moment. There's a lot of conversation around privacy laws. There's a lot of conversation around the death of the cookie. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. The ideal world, or the absolute world, would be where both human identity and digital identifiers are connected to each other. That's where we see the value in both, in understanding humans and understanding human behavior. And actually, one gives context to another. So we believe that human identity gives context to what you see in digital identifiers. Let me give you an example on the next slide. You'll see digital identifiers. If I am I'm a brand, I work on a performance team or a digital team, and I can see that people online are engaging with, so I see one person online engaging with gaming, engaging with rugby, engaging with Lego. The assumption that I would make just by looking at what this person is engaging with is this is a 20-something-year-old male, maybe living in London, who likes sports, but we're missing the context. So if you scratch the surface and you better understand the human identity, you might find that on the next slide, you might find that actually this is a woman who's 35 to 45, has an interest in sports and has young nephews, and therefore is buying the Legos. So the reality is that you need the context to be able to understand the behavior. And actually, this is a real life example from my team at Mindshare. There's, I'll call out Vicky, who's actually the woman who's interested in sports and has a young nephew, and Mark, who's the young 24-year-old, 25 maybe now, on the team, who has those interests. And we create that distinction all the time, and we say, actually, you could be 45 and a woman and have the same interests as a young man, or vice versa. So if you actually look at this graph and you look at the left-hand side of just the human identity, just the context, without the behaviors, you're also missing something. You're also missing what people are doing and what they're engaging with. So we believe that connecting both the human identity to the digital identifiers gives you a much clearer picture of who your audience is. And on the final slide, you'll see that the value in doing so is you have a neutral view of audiences across the whole marketing comms framework and the whole marketing comms process. The human element is brought back in because, in our opinion, we've moved very well down that tech and data route. So it's about bringing the human element back into the process. You streamline the audience planning process when you connect both worlds to each other. It helps you inspire things outside of just media, such as creative development. If I understand the context of this woman who has young nephews and is buying Legos to play with them. It helps plan more efficiently and effectively from end to end. And finally, it optimizes spend because you know exactly who you're trying to reach and there's no wastage along the way. That's it. I look forward to hearing questions and hearing from the rest of the panel.
William, would you like to give us your views on the topic?
Definitely. So I think that was really interesting. I'm jumping kind of straight into mine, which is one of the topics we've been trying to look at is moving beyond claim data. So not totally excluding it, but how we can add to it to get a more layered insight around people. There's a famous example that I always like to start with, which is the launch of the New Day newspaper. I'm not sure if people know that, but in 2016, Trinity Mirror Group launched a new newspaper and they ran a lot of qual and quant research asking people what they wanted. And they said that they wanted a politically neutral newspaper with long form articles. And 3 months after launching, the newspaper closed down because no one bought it and no one read it. And there's an actual quote from the CEO of Trinity Mirror, Simon Fox, who said, at the end of the day, what consumers told us they would do and what they actually did were different things. which is quite a stark example of what can happen when you just rely on claim data. And I think the key there is to try and move with the claim data, but add to it with other kind of layered insights. So things we look at is ethnography, autoethnography, discourse analysis, search behavior, implicit association testing, biometrics, things that can try and capture how people feel as well, what they instinctively think, as well as what they rationally think, and their actual behavior. And then it's really important to try and layer that insight, because any one bit of information on its own can often only give you a partial picture. So many people might have heard of the example of Lady Gaga, which is that if you look on Facebook, her fans are about 90% women. And if you look at that, you might go, oh, all her fans are women. But on Spotify data, it's roughly the people that listen to her are 50% women, 50% men. And so by adding those together, you start to get a better picture that potentially women are more likely to be passionate fans, buy merchandise, express their support openly, but men are just as likely to enjoy the music and listen to it. And so we think it's about layering the insight and getting it from a lot of different areas gives you a kind of fuller picture. And so I just wanted to talk through two examples of how we've tried to do that with some of our clients, I think, to bring it to life and make it seem real, because it's easy to describe it, but I think it's often more illuminating to show it in practice. And one we did was TikTok, who this was quite a while back we started. They obviously wanted to and have subsequently expanded rapidly across Europe. But when they started, they really didn't know much about the different European markets and what would drive growth for them. And as a kind of strategic and research partner for them, we helped in that discussion. And we started actually by looking at 97 million open profiles. And they were interested in 18 to 34. So we ran some tech that was profile picture recognition so that we could try and capture profiles of people roughly 18 to 34. Having run the technology, I was really grateful to see that I still fall within that bracket within imaging technology. But we were able to get 3 million profiles that fitted within the 18 to 34. And then we enriched them across the different social channels. And from there, and you mentioned kind of AI and machine learning, we ran machine learning clustering on that so that we could start to pull together different tribes across the different markets and see what were the different tribes and sub-tribes that existed digitally in different markets, for example, UK crime. And that gave us a really interesting way, based on people's actual digital behavior, to capture those tribes. But I think that was an interesting scale data approach to do that. But we then did want to support it with more traditional research. So we ran qual and quant with those groups. It helped us to produce headroom analysis. So what was the likelihood that those groups would engage with TikTok and we could use them. We also used TGI to make sure that the sizing of the groups that we saw digitally was reflected in claim data. So you got confidence it was accurate. We also asked publishers and got publisher data to show that those groups were similarly large and engaging with content online from publishing titles, again, to prove the size of them. And then we started to look at their views of TikToks by tribe. So one of the things we did was autoethnography through people's mobile phones, getting them to look at TikTok the first time, engage with it, seeing their immediate reaction. You can capture in the moment how they feel about that. You can get some facial coding readings of those as well to kind of see their natural reactions to it. And we looked at information around social discourse and running it through sentiment analysis, topic analysis, how people were responding. I think the most interesting thing from my point of view we did, though, was actually we ran biometrics to find out the types of content that the different tribes responded to. I think that was interesting because, as the New Day example showed, you can't just ask people what they want and then provide it, because it often won't be what they actually respond to. So we showed content to different tribes in different markets and read kind of their biometric response, so EEG, galvanic skin response, to see how they were actually emotionally responding to the content. And it threw up lots of really interesting insights. One of my favorite was that the bigger the tribe, so the bigger the group, the more they responded to celebrity. So for instance, football, you found celebrity football players they responded really well to. But the more niche the group, the more they responded to just people being absolutely amazing at that thing. So if it was skateboarding, if it was magic, they were far less likely to respond to someone who was big within that sport or within that area doing it, and much more was likely to respond to someone who was just absolutely incredible, and in fact seemed to prefer unknown people who were absolutely amazing at those things. And I think it was just really interesting, again, thinking about the example of kind of Lady Gaga, having the claim data, the biometric data, the social data gave us a rich kind of seam of how these different tribes would respond, and gave us ways to genuinely engage at scale across the markets with the different groups and how they would respond. And off the back of that, TikTok were able to develop partnerships, content with their key influencers, and marketing kind of targeting and collateral to grow those different groups and kind of effectively reach the different tribes in different markets with the right content that they knew would cause them to grow and adopt TikTok. As a second case study, I wanted to compare that to Slack, because I think TikTok was very much an example of us doing a lot of work to really break down the different groups in different markets that would respond and find the appropriate messaging and even approach by group. Whereas Slack, we ran across Europe, and what was interesting was we actually found one approach or one universal truth that we could use to cut across the markets. So Slack, we found, was interesting in that, and I'm sure everyone knows Slack, but it's a work messaging service or app that most of us have become very accustomed to in the last 8 months. What they found was that it was very different people that could bring it into a company or even use it. So bakers were using it along the supply chain. Within larger kind of office-based organizations, sometimes it was the CEO, sometimes it was IT, sometimes it was young grads who'd be the first to bring it in. There wasn't a common thread of who was bringing it into companies. So we tried to find one. We analyzed a lot of discourse data of people discussing TikTok or mentioning it in their feeds. And we found that there was one thread that was very consistent across all the types of groups and people and markets. And that was when we ran personality analysis. So using IBM Watson, we analyzed the conversations and found that everyone who had adopted or was talking about Slack had a very open personality and a very neurotic personality type. And that was consistent across all markets and across all kind of different groups of people bringing it in. And then we found we could target that partly through partners that were able to target by a personality type, partly because Touchpoints has done some really interesting analysis looking at personality types and media usage, though that's just the UK, and partly by analysing different publisher sites. And we've gone on the comments section of lots of newspapers, lots of magazines, and analysed the comments to pull out the personality type. Interestingly, the most open and neurotic section of any magazine or newspaper that we looked at was the Guardian culture section, which found very interesting. We presented that to them, and they felt it rang very true of the content and potentially their readers as well. It was something we were able to test, and it seemed to work really well and contributed to kind of better than performance than the target, which was 15% over target. I think it's just interesting to compare the two because it's very two different approaches, but one is much more about the tribes and subgroups and the right content, and then sometimes finding a way that you can cut through across markets with a similar approach. And again, one was much more layered insight, but another was probably one piece of insight that we then tested, proved worked and grew. And that was it. And happy to take any questions after the other speakers.
Jon, would you like to talk this?
We've been very interested over the last few years at exploring going beyond traditional demographic measures and trying to understand people by their basic human psychology. I think there's been such a revolution over the last decade with behavioural science in our understanding of how much decision making is driven by things like heuristics, which are sort of mental shortcuts that we undertake to make our life easier, and how ultimately a lot of the complicated decisions we make are dominated by our feelings. And all those two core little elements are hugely dictated by our personality and our cognitive style of thinking. And a lot of these styles of thinking have been very well mapped out and thought through from the world of psychology. And so what we've been working with Ogilvy is to try and sort of map out the human personality condition, going a bit beyond the traditional big five, thinking underneath some of the layers beneath that, and then looking at mapping out these are some of the different thinking styles of people, and then using that almost as a sort of DNA building blocks for developing more effective communications. Regulatory control is a good example. It's about how we deal with situations, how we navigate through when we're making everyday decisions. Are we thinking more in terms of prevention, not making mistakes, or are we thinking about the opportunities? When I take an exam, do I read the exam paper from cover to cover, make sure I'm not making any mistakes, or just jump straight in? That mindset impacts on decisions I make in everyday shopping world. I might go into a supermarket. Do I see an offer and grab it, or do I evaluate all the pricing and so on? And having a detailed understanding of all these subtle different aspects of the way that we think and see the world, we can essentially understand decision making. That's been our wider objective. But what we've been trying to look at doing that is on a global scale and understanding how some of these things vary country to country. There are so many cultural factors that are layered upon this that are really important to understand. And so we've been involved in this challenge to try and map out all these types of ways of thinking around the world. If we move to the next slide, what we're faced with is a tremendous challenge in doing that. If you take the very classical traditional measures of ways we measure things like personality, very heavily reliant on things like agreement scale questions. And what we find is that they just simply don't travel very well around the world. The same questions can get completely different answers in different cultures. And so it makes it very difficult for us to cross-compare, really understand and use data on an international scale because of the fuzzy nature of the data we capture. To the next slide. What I've been on a journey over the last few years, trying to understand that and trying to work out how to understand people in different parts of the world, and by understanding the differences in how they answer survey questions so that we can rebalance our understanding of actually what they're saying. This is an example of the sort of challenge we face. Probably anyone done any form of international research realizes that in some countries, people are a lot more likely to agree to something than in another. For example, in India, where 80% of any questions we're going to answer in a positive dimension, compared to Japan, where it's only about 20% net positive. Exactly the same questions, you get a completely different answer to contend with. We also have to contend with the point that has already been raised, that what we gather in surveys with traditional questions often is a little of a step away from the actual truth. This top chart shows the gap between questions where we know the answer. I know how many people in a country go to university. I know how many people vote. When you ask them these questions in a survey, you often get a completely different answer. One of the heart of the problems is that we're really not very good at being honest about ourselves and our own behaviours, the chart beneath. And if you ask someone, are you a dependable, self-disciplined individual, 90% of us agree to that statement. And so what can I do as a market researcher with that information? I mean, it's like if everyone says they are, I can't differentiate anybody. No one wants to admit to being critical or anxious. And so what we've been, we've written, the paper I've published that we won awards with Christopher Graves is really looking at better ways to understand and measure human characteristics at scale that gets around some of these challenges. And if you move to the next slide, I'll just talk about a couple of the solutions that we found the most effective in trying to tackle some of these underlying problems. I think the heart of the issue with so much market research is we're asking people about their opinions and their attitudes. And what we found is that if we can shift the questions to more behavioral based questions, you get a lot more cost-consistent answers. So, a typical segmentation, you might say, to understand about attitudes towards, say, the family and your lifestyle at home, you might say, is it important to spend time with your family over dinner? Now, you can see here the answers between India and the UK, two different cultures. The Indians very positively agreeing to that statement. The British people being slightly more reticent to agree to that statement. If you ask people in the very general terms, how often do you eat together as a family? Again, there's a massive difference between what we find from India and what we get in the UK. 60% of Indians say they eat together every day, compared to the English, which is 42%. And because the way I'm answering that is in a very general way, I'm thinking, oh yeah, we eat together. But if I then think a very concrete behavioural question, which is last week, how many days last week did you eat together? the numbers come down to a lot more closely aligned. And we found that as a consistent solution that if you can identify real behaviors, if you move to the next example, you can get answers that are a lot closer to the truth. So no one, for example, in the survey would admit to being disorganized. So you have to think of ways around question that measures conscientiousness. But if I say, tell me what your clothes drawers are like, half of people we sample are prepared to admit that their clothes drawers are a little bit untidy. And then if you start with the next example, if you start to ask lots of little questions like that, you know, when do you do the washing up straight away or afterwards? How do you park? Do you floss? These tiny little questions that are a little bit easier for me to answer truthfully adds up to a lot more consistent story about someone's personality and characteristics. And what we found is that if we build a survey around that framework of asking more concrete behavioral type measures, these then become a lot more cost consistent across culture because you're actually doing something tangible. Now, you have to be very careful about what you measure about. For example, you know, you might say, do you recycle? Which is a very good measure of conscientiousness in America or Western Europe, but no one in Asia really recycles, or most of the countries in Asia don't. So that question is a behavioral question that doesn't actually tell the truth about someone's conscientiousness for that market. And so the way that we developed our measures is really we start with a very expansive range of different things. We look at how people answer them in different parts of the world, look for consistent patterns of behavior, the most reflective behaviors that we can most reliably reproduce around the world. And then these become our core measures. If we move to the next slide, the other really quite astonishing positive impact we've discovered in improving the honesty of feedback is by simply making people aware of their behavioral biases and when they answer questions. We did this at a groundbreaking moment where we showed people this grumpy cat and said it's hard to look at yourself, but can you have a go? And we found people a lot more honestly reporting their moodiness. And the next example, we started to use that in lots of ways, asking people to think about what their real lives are like and highlighting the fact that some people maybe put on a bit of a show when they're identifying themselves in surveys. And we want to know the real you. And again, we found it improved the quality and consistency of data across culture. And applying that, if you move to the last slide, applying those techniques, we've discovered that we can firstly pull apart greater differentiation of opinion that's more reliable, but probably more importantly, we can develop measures that are a lot more consistent and portable around cultures, and it gives us a baseline then for comparison, which is we think a little bit more useful I'm looking at this obviously from a pure form market research point of view for all the other things that all these other people are talking about doing. But that's a quick summary of my viewpoint on this whole issue. That it's about tackling how you answer the questions as much as anything.
Thank you very much, Jon. Really interesting. So lastly, Massimo, would you like to share some points of view with us?
Of course, you have heard from the people who speak before me how difficult, is to manage market research, to get insight. It's really to understand people. So imagine on the other side how difficult it is to develop brand that goes internationally, having all this difficulty, having all these kind of cultural differences. So how can you develop a brand that has to keep his heritage, has to keep his purpose, but has to adapt cultures and different countries where you want to use and launch this brand and product. And this is also I've been part of my working life in the last 10 years. So I went through all these difficulties that the people before me mentioned about getting understanding the consumer, getting understanding the value, the culture. What I've realized over the course of the years is that what it is very important to understand from consumer to get them develop the brand and communicate the brand in the best way is the purpose of the product that you're trying to sell to them. So why are they using them? Which is the way they're using this product? Which is the purpose behind it? Which is, as we said, the cultural code behind these actions. I'll give you a brief example. Think about what does disinfection means in different parts of the world, and think about what does disinfection means for us in Europe now versus what does it mean? It used to mean like 6 months ago. So maybe back in January, December, disinfection of houses, of clothes was just talking about having something, of course, much more clean, but we're not paying that much attention of this. And think about how much is it different now. And disinfection can somehow protect our lives. And this is not the way that what you're doing, but is the purpose of what you're doing. And in my experience, managing a brand that was all about disinfection, having to sell this brand in Europe, in China, in India, in the Middle East, all these different countries had completely different approach to disinfection. So there is behind the different purpose for the disinfection. And you have to get into it, understanding it, and try to really get to the purpose of what people do with your product. And same is across all fast moving. I've been working in the food and beverage industry, which is pretty much the same. So we all drink coffee. Why do we drink coffee? Why do we do this specific coffee? What are we expecting to have for this coffee? If I can give you an example, during my time in the coffee industry, I figured out that in the US, we had such a big sales of decaf coffee, decaffeinated coffee versus normal one, more than 3 times versus what we have in Europe. And this was very weird. What we understood is that since the coffee in the US is more about a milk beverage, which is with milk, with sugar, with syrup, it's not just the way we drink coffee, it's more a kind of dessert. So people tend to have this at the end of the dinner, like a treatment, you know, and so if the dinner is at night, they want to have a decaf kind of coffee versus the normal coffee. So again, why are you drinking coffee? Are you drinking coffee because you want to wake up? Are you drinking coffee because you want to have some treatment? You are drinking coffee because you want to reward yourself in some way. So this is the essence of what the brand has to understand. This can be and can look like complicated for certain reasons, and it is. But for other reasons, and specifically in this moment, this can be facilitated from a technology perspective. So if I think about all the discussion we had before with the people who spoke with me before, we know that there is a lot of technology behind this. We can now understand better consumer. We have the capabilities to deep dive into what they really think about when we do a market research, or when we do a product test, or when we interact in any case with them. And to give you just another example of what happened to me in the past, I was having a kind of one-to-one conversation with a person in China talking about disinfection in laundry. So what does disinfecting a laundry wash mean for a person in China? And during this conversation, what I have discovered is that this person was having in her room, in her house, 2 different washing machines. So there was one small washing machine and a big normal washing machine. And the small one was just for underwear and or baby clothes. So mean to say that this washing machine was just for these things, where they do believe there is much more need of disinfection. And this is something I didn't know. This is something didn't came across in any other kind of market research, even though before it was very, very kind regional part of China, although we're talking about 200-300 million people, so huge amount of people there. And start deep diving into it. And once I heard that it was a kind of common habit, what we have done, we have run a quantitative study to confirm this, and we figured out that this was really the case. And so we discovered that in this specific part of China, talking about 1/3 of China roughly, they do have this small washing machine just for baby clothes and for underwear. And of course, this was a completely different approach for the disinfection, which we used not only to develop our communication strategy, because of course we were communicating on this need, but also our product development strategy, because we needed a smaller cup for dosing and maybe a smaller bottle, because we need less product. So, and everything has came across from a single interview I had with a single person, thanks to technology. It was kind of Zoom meeting or Skype meeting, which are very used now, but is very common. And from them, all the process started, and we figured out the importance of this part. So if I just had to summarize and I want to see what, again, is fundamental for me, going behind demographics, which we heard is important, going behind any kind of classification, even going behind the use of the product. You really need to understand the essence of the culture and the purpose of the reason why your customer are using your product in that specific situation, that specific scenario. And once you do this, I think you are in a good position to establish a successful brand in different countries in the world.
And thank you all for some very interesting insights. There is one question that we've just got from Gail. How do you gauge open and neurotic? And it's a question to all the panel, but I wonder, William, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so I think when I saw it come up, from my point of view, I'd answer it around kind of social data and discourse data. There's technologies that you can run it through that have analysed the way people write, the language that they use, the syntax, the grammar, and have been able to correlate that to types of personality. It's not perfect. There are, elements to it that can be improved, but it's something we've found has been quite good for IBM Watson is one of the people who do that. If you've got enough data and varied data, you can run it through, and they've found strong correlations between the type of language, words and sentence structure people use and the personality types they have, that can give you quite a good initial guide to something around topics or types of audiences and what their personality traits are.
Anybody else in the panel like to add to that?
I've written a paper about it. All the big five personality characteristics are best measured behaviorally. Openness is we measure it around a wide cluster of indicators: diversity of interests, the types of interests people have. We present them with statements and ask them to select things that they can identify with, and we pick out we classify them, and the types of people who are more open tend to pick a broader range of things, a more diverse range of things. Neuroticism, that grumpy cat I showed you, actually was one of the challenges we face in measuring. We don't actually call it neuroticism anymore because that's a little bit judgmental. It's called emotional control. And we very specifically use that grumpy cat to allow people to admit to being a bit of a worrier, to having, to being a bit more anxious and so on, which is sort of do feed into the emotional control measure. And we found that is a really important factor in allowing people to be put at ease to be able to reveal those types of things about themselves in a survey. And my criticism of a lot of my criticism of the IBM Watson system, it's based upon a very outdated way of measuring the actual personality traits in the very first place. The technique they used to then tie that together using linguistics is very clever, but the baseline measure a little bit, I think, is a bit woolly.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'll move on to another question.
I think just on the IBM Watson thing, it's a fair comment about it being a bit woolly. It's obviously the ability to try and pull out that sort of insight cost effectively across multiple markets. It's more expensive to do it in a fuller way. So it's trying to get the balance between what will give you the most rigorous insight and what will give you an insight that you can then potentially test in digital, find out if it works. But I think, as often market research is, it's that balance between rigor and the cost effectiveness of giving you an idea you can test relatively inexpensively.
Thanks. Another question from the audience. I'll ask Karen this one first of all. How do you see the change we're all talking about? I mean, is this a sudden shift or more of a transition that has been accelerated recently due to different reasons in terms of fragmentation? So
it's definitely not a sudden change. It's something we've observed has been happening over a number of years. The story about 3 years ago, I think, we restructured our team and the way that we approached audiences to be much more around addressable audiences. So we found that in a lot of the briefs that we were getting, there was my target audience is an adventurer or a culture seeker or someone open and neurotic. And I guess the exercise that we had to do, or the work that then went on in the background, was how do I translate that to something that's addressable in media? Because when you're buying media, and Will, I'd love to hear your perspective as well on how you would test open and neurotic and digital, because we found that we needed to help teams understand, well, how do I find someone who's an adventurer in media? What does that look like? What are the things they're engaging with? And that was something we started to do 3 years ago. And I think today we've gone into super drive in that digital world. We're really, because of the developments in technology, because of the developments in data and data connection, we're now trying to catch up to this world, hence the connecting both worlds together.
I think on that, it's there's two parts to the answer. One is, I think it's incredibly important to make sure we're focusing on things we can actually target. I think there was, an old world used to be you create a profile to inspire a creative, and then you tell someone in media to target that profile, and you get these long things going. Susan is 23, adventurous, likes to nibble a bit of dairy cadmy milk at the weekend, incredibly patronizing and terrible profiles that you could never target. And it wasn't helpful. So I think we've moved on really well, and we focus more on behavioral things. So what people do as key indicators of who they are and key things we can target off of. The one area I think which is interesting is because digital is relatively inexpensive, I was saying earlier, to target, we went through an exercise of going through the comment sections and sections of different papers, magazines, to try and understand what that would come out as running through kind of IBM Watson. And that was, again, because you can do it for free with their API, a way of kind of codifying the different personality types of different places you could run advertising. And we found that gave us an opportunity to test if we could run certain types of personalities by targeting certain places. And it seemed to so far have worked in one or two ways, but we've definitely had experiences of other things we've done where we've tried to find interesting ways to target, and running the test has told us that it doesn't work. So it's very much kind of test and learn process for that.
Another question we had, and I'll ask Massimo this one actually. I'd be interested to know what the most striking example you can recall of either not taking on board local culture and leading to failure, or on the contrary, having leveraged cultural insights to reshape an innovation.
Yeah, I think that maybe the best answer I can give you to this is about my my job in Lavazza. When in the moment I've joined the company was, of course, leading the coffee market industry in Italy and in many other countries. But still, maybe 60% of the business was coming from Italy, and another 40% of it was coming, of course, overseas and from other countries, many other countries. And majority of this business in other countries was coming basically through bars and restaurants. So where, there was this strong heritage, kind of Italian heritage, Italian culture, way of drinking coffee in the Italian way, to the point that Italy's favorite coffee was the claim of the company at the time. And it was about bringing the Italianity of, the company around the world. But when we then started to try to sell a different kind of coffee, because of course not everybody drinks the same kind of coffee, someone drinks espresso, someone is drip coffee, someone is instant coffee. This claim or positioning was not working, because you position yourself as the company who is able to make the best Italian coffee, and then you try to sell me another kind of coffee, I will never buy it. I don't buy the position of the company. And so after, of course, many months of researches and many discussions and many activity with agencies, with internal meetings and whatever, we have identified that one of the strengths of Lavazza in the coffee industry, it was and it is the heritage of a company which was established in 1895, and so 125 years of history, many experience around the globe. And so we changed the positioning of the company from Italian's favorite coffee to Turin, Italy, 1895. So is where the company was established, and where the company was born, and how long have we dealt with coffee in the last in the year. And so from this, our kind of ambition was, no matter the kind of coffee you want to drink, and no matter the kind of coffee we are providing to you, with our knowledge and with our expertise, we can do the best out of the specific coffee. So changing completely the approach of the company to the embracing the culture of the country where the company was going has shifted the company, which is now, maybe 30% of the business coming from Italy and 70% from abroad. Not because the Italy market went down, but just because now the international markets grow a lot. And I think it is one of the most, maybe successful story I can tell you about how it's important to embrace the culture of the country.
So I've got a question from Pedro. I'm going to kind of open this to anybody on the panel or all of you. So how do you deal or avoid cultural appropriation? This is an easy way to reproduce local cliches that could bring undesirable effects for global brands wanting to conquer local markets. Who would like to have a grant? Karen?
Take this one, Paul. Yeah, 2 comments. I think it's a great question. We've seen a lot of cultural appropriation in the fashion industry not long ago. So fashion brands, touching on cultural heritage that are offensive. And I think one of the ways we do that is we work very closely with our global network and the local markets in getting their feedback into the way that we build audiences. Is this offensive? Is this culturally relevant? And the second way, and I know Melanie won't plug herself, but the second way is we work with companies like Creative Culture to go into those local markets and understand what's happening at a local level, and to make sure that comms that we produce or pieces of work we produce are not culturally appropriated or offensive.
There's a question again, and I'll open this up to the panel. It's a question from one of our audience, and it's asking about whether anybody has a view about the generation nobody talks about, as they put it, silver surfers, and whether their behaviours across cultures are more similar or more diverse than others. Does anybody have a view on this who's been dealing with this particular marketplace or have research?
I can talk to it. I mean, I think it's often the market that many people feel isn't addressed enough. I'll quickly say first, I remember a presentation when I was younger from the Telegraph coming in and explaining to a bunch of 25-year-olds how they had no money and the silver surfer generation had all the money. And we got stopped trying to target ourselves, and we all walked out incredibly depressed about the fact that all of the money had been taken from us through property prices. I think it's a really important group and often an underserved one. I think the stat that is often said is that the average age of a person who buys a new car is 55, I think maybe 52, and yet everyone thinks of a new car being a 32-year-old. I would then say beyond that actually my personal view is, and the experience I've had, I wouldn't say that older people are more or less homogenous. They're just as rich and varied a group as younger people and require just as much research. And just as you see a lot of thought pieces around how millennials aren't one group when they can be 18 or 34-year-old parents of 2 children, older people are not one group. They're diverse, wide-ranging people that need a mixture and a varied layered approach to research to understand them. So I think it's just broadly recognizing that they're often more valuable and should be thought of more generally, but when they are, it requires more in-depth research, recognizing the variation that exists amongst them.
But I'll just add to that as well, Will. In the audience world or the research world, there's always a box that's 55 plus. And I think we're trying to move beyond that, because 55 is very different than 65 and 75. And like you say, it's a very diverse audience. We've done a really beautiful report. We've called it Ageless Living, because we found that silver surfers is now an offensive term. If anybody listening would like it, please feel free to reach out and I'll share that report. It's a global report.
I have just a point to add to what William and Karen just said is, I think, again, it depends on geography, and having done quite a lot of roundtables on countries from far beyond European borders over the last few months, we shall not forget that the median age in many, many countries and the most populous countries are actually around 35 or below 40. So it's how you measure that in terms of who your target audience is and the markets that you are targeting in the first place.
My point would be, as we reach a certain age, particularly as we enter retirement, we express our culture and our upbringings in incredibly, everything we've learned through our existence it becomes expressed in our behaviors, and I think that becomes a lot more diverse in some respects as we reach a certain age, because we've all grown in lots of different directions. Obviously it's a mistake to homogenize a group of individuals. I think they require some of the most subtle and nuanced forms of research to really understand some of their motivations. There's clearly some unifiers based upon the life stage, but in terms of their mercantile activity, what they're spending money on, it's incredibly diverse.
Massimo, have you seen any particular points of view or any activity that you've directed to an older age group?
I remember one of the biggest activity I've done in this direction during my time within McDonald's. McDonald's is usually, of course, a younger kind of target group. And we've developed a program for silvers, as we used to call them. Although I was silver at the time, so I was kind of the target group from this perspective. Interesting, what we discovered is that what is changed versus the past is that this age of people, of course, they do have money to spend, but interestingly, they are getting information from the younger. So in the past, it was more like a younger going to seek for information, now with new technology, new things coming up, it's a kind of reverse war when if you want to get in touch with silvers, you also need to get in touch with youngers, because they are the one that have been asked, from silvers, how to behave, what to buy, which school, what is not. So it's a kind of interaction within the two generations, because the technology is what linked them together. The younger one having the last update, and the older one not feeling very comfortable in having this kind of update. So there is a cross kind of selling which you can do between the two generations, or the one and the third generation, to make them connect and to try to work with both at the same time. And I think it's quite interesting. And for example, in that perspective, it has worked because we try to create a kind of campaign from teenagers. How can McDonald's be cool even for your grandpa? And we went through some activations. When you went through some ADV, and we actually saw it was working. And because maybe that this young man was going to the parent, young guy will go to the grandpa and say, "Why do you go to McDonald's?" and explain why you should have gone to McDonald's. And I think this was quite successful. And yet this connection is quite interesting for me. At least this experience in Europe, as Melanie was saying, of course, the target age is very different in other countries. I think in Europe, in the US, this connection can be somehow leveraged.
Okay, thank you. With a question, and I'll start with William on this, and I think Jon or anybody else may also want to contribute. How does behavioural science cater for cross-cultural differences, as it is a reality brands face? And it seems simplistic to think that there is one human truth that can apply to all profile types, without taking into consideration that culture has shaped their behaviours and beliefs.
Definitely. So I think culture can massively change the ways different behavioural science concepts and biases play. So for one example, social norms. There's two different examples. There's the famous example, which I think people will know, of tax returns. And when you tell people in the UK that other people are returning their taxes on time, it improves the rate at which people do, except I think for the top 5% of earners, I think it is, who you suddenly find it makes them less likely to, because they feel more special and better than everyone else, and they don't want to do what other people do. And so you need to tell them about the benefit of the money that they pay and what that produces. Similarly, across cultures, the benefit of here oversimplifying slightly, but there's an analysis that shows that cultures that have experienced more threats are more likely to follow social norms. So you see that whether it was natural threats or cultures that got invaded a lot, and you can see that even in states in America, there's a regression analysis will show a relationship between the extent to which they're influenced by social norms and the level of historic threat that group or society has felt or has faced. So there's lots of analysis that can go on within a country and between countries to understand the way different behavioral science concepts play. The thing I would say is that what we find so far to be relatively universal is that there isn't a society of Vulcans out there on Earth. There is no group that are purely rational and behave in that rational man way that we might have thought of people 15, 20 years ago. And so behavioral science as an overall approach to understanding people is driven a lot by unconscious decision-making, having biases, I think is universal and should be a starting point for how we understand behavior. But definitely you want to start analyzing different subgroups, different cultures, different markets to understand how those behavioral science concepts play differently.
There is so much influence of particularly things like religion on people's broader mindsets. Fatalism, for example, which leads to things like optimism bias, which is a sense about your vulnerability to things like disease, and correlates with smoking. If you look at that, we actually did an analysis across all the countries across Asia and looked at levels of optimism bias and the level of smoking, and it's underpinned by the religious sensibilities in any one country. The broad big five are fairly generically consistent across culture, but there are lots of subtleties with which it gets expressed because of the nature of people's willingness to share information about themselves. Certainly, extroversion is measurably different in America compared to other parts of the world. Extroversion, I mean, changes by age as well. But unless you've got a really stable way of measuring the baseline personality characteristics, you don't know whether it's something to do with how you're asking the questions or whether it is a cultural phenomenon. And I think the most critical thing is to be able to have the most stable and reliable way of measuring each of the. So what we do is we do a country benchmark of all the core personality characteristics, so we can map them out in general terms, and then we can then become a bit more relativistic in the way that we assess things, because it's, there are a lot of subtleties to it. Future, Melanie, I was talking to you about the very language of a country. The Germans have got a very blended past, present, and future in their language. They use the same structure to define the now and the future, whereas the English language has got very distinct differences between now and the future, different linguistic constructs. And it's no coincidence that the Germans are first to put their beach towels on the out when they go on holiday. They are more future facing, they invest more. And you look at languages where there was less of a distinction between the past and the future, they tend to be more future facing in their whole cultural outlook, and it's measurable.
I've got a question that might be interest to all of you, but maybe Karen, I don't know if you've got a view to kick this off. Does the panel have any advice about keeping abreast of changing consumer behaviours? It's a pretty leading question.
So we have a cultural team at Mindshare that looks at changing culture and changing consumer behaviours within culture. I would say read the news every day, see what's happening, keep an ear out. We can also, there are a couple of tools which I think we'll add to as well. So social listening, stuff that we do that enables us to understand, even search landscaping, what people are currently talking about and what people are currently searching for, to pick up trends around that way as well. And those are 3 little tips.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think the first thing is very much look at behavior that you can actually track and then maybe forecast it forward 6 months. I'd be very, very dubious of anyone who can tell you the big 3 trends in the next 10 years. It's amazing how you find that they never get called back on it 5 years later about whether they were right or wrong. But I think it's that search is great, discourse it, and then trying to find the things. I think don't try and forecast too far forward would be my biggest bit of advice with that information.
I've got a point of view on this in that, I mean, I think the point is, as much as anything is that markets are becoming ever more fashion driven and conscious driven by the advent of social media. We're now exposing the world to a whole load of new things, like, you know, what's in our homes and what we're drinking, in a way that up until now you had distinct fashion sectors, like what we listen to music wise, our haircuts, of what we wear. Because, you know, whenever I go on social media, I'd take a photograph of myself doing something. All the things I do, my makeup, there's loads of things now becoming so much more driven by fashion and what we share. And so it's becoming so much accelerated. The half-life of a beer brand is reduced by a huge amount of people now drinking craft beer, and people are not fashionable to be seen holding a certain type of beer brand. You have to be in the same way as any other fashion. You have to be. So the churn in certain markets is accelerating so dramatically. So I haven't necessarily answered the question, but boy, is it important these days. And you look at the cycles and how they vary. For example, attitudes towards, say, IKEA in China, that's a really hot fashion brand because, you know, and yet in, you know, Western Europe, it's a very, you know, it's a different part of a life cycle. So because it's new, it is the new thing.
We've had a couple of questions around authenticity, and I'd be interested in the panel's view on this and how brands can appear authentic when targeting perhaps a very heterogeneous audience, or how it can appeal to 2 people from each end of a spectrum. And I'd be interested to know what or anything about authenticity, the way that brands present themselves across cultures. I'd be interested to know what any of the panel members think about this.
I think if I can start to answer the question, of course, the authenticity is one of the most important things. As I said before, is balancing, you know, the brand versus, if I can say in this way, the localization. But I think there are a couple of aspects to take into consideration when you go into this direction. The first one is how much credibility you have within your spectrum, within your customers, within your followers, within your ambassador or whoever. So how much, you know, you're a credible brand, how much you behave the way you see you behave and you want people to behave. The value that you share are literally the value that you have. And this, for me, starts from the most important ambassadors of the company, which are the employees. So everything you try to bring outside the company has to be embedded within the culture of the company. And if you can do this, this is where you can create and have this strong authenticity that in somehow is then split and maybe adapted to different cultures. But to make it very simple, if you have your 5 values, you know, as a company, it's not just to stick them on the wall at the entrance, but you have to really to believe in them, behave in them, and make sure that people that work with you behave the same way. So when you've done this, you create this kind of community within your employees that then goes out and create a community of customers, which they believe in the same kind of value. It might not be the same that you have in your company, but of course, it is the base of what you present outside. So basically being authentic, first of all, with yourself within the organization before then showing out to the customer and to the world.
One thought, just to be slightly provocative on it, is I'm not sure, is authenticity as important as it used to be? I just say that from the point of view politically, we've seen potentially people who claim to be one thing and be totally another, and it's fine for them. We've seen lots of brands get caught not following their values, lots of brands who have ads that say they have a brand purpose, that they care about minority rights and things like that, but own sweatshops, and they don't seem to get punished for it. I think it's a nice thing to think, but there's probably, even culturally, the notion of authenticity, where it used to be all about, as a slogan, keeping it real, that doesn't exist as much anymore. People can play with their identity far more than they ever used to be able to. I'm not sure that the notion of authenticity is as important as it used to be, or maybe is as important as we always thought it was, because there seems to be lots of examples where people can not live up to what they would say was their authentic selves and don't get as punished for it. I don't have the data to back that up, but it was just a thought based on things seeing recently in the last year or so.
But if you look, for example, what happened a few years ago, okay, this was maybe an extreme situation where the Sultan of Brunei made this statement against homosexuality, and all this Dorchester hotel went empty, basically, in a very few days, and he had to come back, and review his politics on this, and the impact there was massive. So yeah, it's quite a fair question and fair provocation, which I got it, but I think that long term these things are kind of if you look, for example, what happened in with Under Armour at the beginning of the Trump presidency, when they were supporting and they will get rid of many customers because of the reason. So it's a very risky and tricky, place where to play. Of course, everything now you do in a way is amplified globally. So I think it's quite risky, and you quite should try to behave the way you say.
It's an interesting point, Will, because you've got, Nike is successful in its stand against inequality, but Pepsi wasn't in its stand against right? The famous Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad. So when does authenticity for a brand work and when doesn't it work? And I think it's very much, it might sound silly, but authenticity is in the eye of the beholder. It's the consumer that decides whether this is acceptable for you to be authentic in this way or not as a brand.
I think it's that. Also, there's probably an argument to say that Nike made a very, very good ad, just thinking of Kodak, and Pepsi made a very, very bad ad. So it's partly in the eye of the holder, but also in the hand of the execution.
Great, thank you. Here's one question, and again, to anybody who'd like to answer it. When looking at segmentation globally, there's always a need to create clutters, and we often struggle to find the best way to approach this per region, groups of markets, etc., without striking the lowest common denominator. It feels a bit presumptuous to assume that geographic regions such as the Baltics, for example, or Africa, will respond to the same messages and are one and the same. So does the panel have any thoughts on this? So creating clusters and looking at the lowest common denominator.
I'm going to jump in and say it really depends. It depends what type of brand you're creating segmentation for. And that will dictate the clusters of markets that you look at. So I'll give you an example of an air purifier, right? It will create clusters based on air quality of the markets. Or if you take a brand that is for curly hair, right? It will clusters based on the user need. So it really depends what the brand is and what positioning it's looking for.
Listen, thank you all very much. Finally, what we like to do is do's and don'ts from our subject today, from each panel member. So one do and one don't, or one piece of positive advice and something to avoid across the whole subject that we've been talking about today. So I might start with Jon. Would you have anything to one do or don't?
I would underline my point that if you ask a generic, unthought through question, you're going to get a meaningless answer. So try and really try and think about what a way of asking the question that will reveal the truth. If on any topic, on any segmentation, anything you're doing internationally, that's the most critical thing. Avoid using agreement scales.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Massimo, do you have anything or?
I think that I tried to say at the beginning, maybe the most important do is try to understand literally the purpose of your customers. So what they're doing, why they're doing this, why they're buying this product. And second, when it comes to don't make it too general, and make sure that you have an answer almost for everybody.
William.
So my don't is a bit similar, but don't just ask people what they want and then deliver it to them and assume that will work. And the do is, because understanding people and reaching them effectively is more complex than some people think, do work with the sort of people that you see on this call that will put the effort in to have a genuine and nuanced understanding of people and how to reach them.
Thank you very much. Karen.
Thank you for letting me go last and have time to prepare that one. I would say do be uncomfortable and learn about different ways of building audiences from different experts and lean into worlds that you're not necessarily comfortable with. And don't discount the importance of understanding what drives people or what motivates people, the human at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you all very much for those comments. And Melanie, will you have one do or don't to round us off?
Well, no, I think it was very, very well summed up by everyone. I think the fact that an answer is as good as the question that Jon raises, I think it really sums it up about, getting outside of your comfort zone, trying to see all the different nuances that are out there and make sure you ask the right questions and the right level of questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And we've had a few comments from the audience. Really insightful and valuable session. Yes, fascinating. And so thank you very much to everybody. Sadly, we've come to the end. Goodbye, everyone.